It has become sort of my yearly tradition that every October we get into the spirit of Halloween by settling in to talk about yet another more spooky samurai horror film. 2 years ago, we took a look at Kaneto Shindo's Kuruneko, and last year, with the help of my old film school friend Mack, we did a long deep dive and discussion into Masaki Kobayashi's Kwaidan. This year, we are going to be doing the same, yet finally at long last, we'll be covering the long-anticipated Onibaba, another film from Kaneto Shindo that premiered in 1964. So grab yourself some tea or cider or pumpkin spice coffee, whatever it is you want to sip, because this will be a longer discussion video yet again with my good friend Mac, who is returning to dive into it all with us.
Hey everyone, Mack here. I went to college with Nick. We spent a lot of time talking about movies and talking about all things film and cinema wise. I'm a screenwriter, film director, and musician on the side, and am looking into starting my own YouTube channel, which I said last time, which tells you just how well that's going. But yeah, I'm excited to get into this.
And just so you know, this review will have spoilers. We're going to be going into all of it. So be forewarned, if you have not seen Onibaba, there are spoilers ahead. So, Onibaba is an interesting film. This is my first time watching it.
As for me,
I've always been told about it, and I've seen it in the Criterion collection, and I've always been kind of just it's been on my list for a while, but it just for some reason I never actually have gone through the length to watch it yet. So I'm glad I did though, because it certainly is a trip.
yes, it is. I was not expecting like the first half of the film feels very different than the second half. And by the second half, it gets very intense, and I really love that. I love how the slow moving, how slow it moves, and how it has a very minimalist structure, and how there's not a lot of characters,
Yeah.
but yet the entire like the setting is a character in itself.
Yeah, it's a very self-contained story, and it has this slow burn, but then when things do kick off, you're like, okay, here we go. But at the same time, like you're enjoying that kind of character development build up, and because it's so contained.
It's very reminiscent, or at least I can see a lot of modern like folk horror films kind of use a lot of some of the similar aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Especially like some of the films by like Ben Wheatley. The one that really sticks out is The Field in England, because it's something that takes place in a kind of an open field. It's in black and white. It's a period piece, much like Onibaba. So when I was watching it, that was one of the films that kind of popped in my head. I'm
Mm.
like, I wonder if this is one of Ben Wheatley's sources of inspiration for that film. So
Yeah, and even just googling the film itself, you can see in different articles talking about all the different films that Onibaba would go on to influence, and directors that it would influence. It's really a unique film that, it's simple at first, but then you look at what it did that will go on to influence other filmmakers with a lot of the choices with, not only cinematography, but storytelling devices and things. It's just it really
oh,
it's
absolutely.
worthwhile.
And I think also we wouldn't have Japanese horror the way we have it now without this movie, because it there's so many like Ju-on, Ringu, all of them just have a lot of these elements that uh, can just easily be traced back to Onibaba and his other film, Kuroneko.
Yeah, Kuruneko, the first film that I did a Halloween kind of film review for, was also directed by Kaneto Shindo, the director of Onibaba. However, I think he directed that one a few years later. This was his earlier film before then.
Yeah,
But
1964.
yes, but they do both also star the same actress for one of the leading roles.
Nabuko
Yeah,
Otowa?
yeah, who actually
Otowa, okay.
was his wife. So it's you go, oh yeah, so she was in both, and you go, oh okay, I understand why.
Yeah.
So anyways, the plot of Onibaba is like I said, very self-contained. basically the story, and I'll get into the history of it in a bit because there is a lot of juicy history details in here that do relate to feudal Japan and the history of the samurai. But it takes place where these two women, a mother and her daughter-in-law, are sort of in this field, living in this hut, killing samurai who are maybe wandering home from war. And like I said, there is a lot of war going on at this time. However, it's not the Sengoku Jidai, but like I said, we'll get into that in a little bit here. Anyways, these two women are killing samurai. They are salvaging their armor and weapons, and they are selling them for food, essentially. But eventually, another samurai returns home who went to war with the mother's son, and also the husband of the daughter-in-law there. In this husband, this son, he didn't come home. He actually died in the war, but his friend returned home. And slowly you start to see the friend here. He has some ulterior motives. He wants to seduce the girl living with the mother. Eventually he does succeed in seducing her, but the mother is afraid that by attracting the younger woman away, then the mother will be left alone. And I don't know if she's afraid that she's going to die alone, or if she's going to just kind of have trouble surviving on her own. But eventually she starts trying to lie and scare the younger woman into not going with the samurai figure, because she's trying to persuade her that doing so would be sinful, and that it is a sin. Of course, we're not talking about sin in the eyes of Christianity. We're talking about sin in the eyes of Shinto Buddhism at the time, and that should be banished into their version of hell for having these kind of premarital relationship with the samurai who came home. And finally, this eventually leads to sort of, should we say, retribution? Something mysterious happens, and it's not exactly explained what it is. And this is where I'm going to hand it over to Mack, because this is where things get a bit more unique.
In the original Shin Buddhist parable that Shindo heard as a child, was that an old woman was furious with her daughter-in-law for continually neglecting household chores to go off to a temple and pray. She hides in the bushes along the path. When the younger woman comes along, she jumps out wearing a demon mask that terrifies her. And Buddha punishes the old woman for her dishonesty and impiety by sticking the mask to her face. And the old woman desperately claws and scrabbles at the grotesque mask, but she can't get it off. Eventually, she prays to Buddha to let her remove it, and Buddha mercifully agrees. But this mercy reveals itself as something quite different when she takes off the mask. So in the film, she puts on the mask to scare her daughter-in-law during a rainstorm. And what she finds out, as the warrior who was wearing the mask before her found out, is that once rain hits the mask, it sticks to the face. So she has no way to get this mask off, and she eventually gets her daughter-in-law, and it explains to her that she was doing this to scare her, and that she'll give her anything and allow her to do whatever she wants as long as she can take the mask off her. And once the mask is broken, she takes it off. The younger woman takes off the mask and realizes that the older woman's face is now disfigured, much as the masked warrior before, his face was disfigured once the older woman took off the mask. I'm going to kind of get off topic just a little bit, because there is something I wanted to talk about, and that's about like the deformity itself that happens on your face, is that it's very reminiscent to that of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's purposeful because Kaneto even said, Shindo said it himself, that was the inspiration, was like that's what their face was going to look like. So much like many films made in Japan from the 1950s onward, there's just a lot of metaphors. There's just little metaphors here and there about the atomic bomb for something that wouldn't have happened for another 600 years.
Yeah, That is actually really interesting to think about, that was an influence. I wonder if you could really dive in further, because I know with a film like Rashomon, for example, that's a film that you know you can dive into and be like, what's the Japanese kind of psychology after World War II and how they should be seen and represented and lead their lives. And I wonder how far you could go with this film and sort of dissect it in regards to that and thematically and symbolism. It's curious.
It's implied that there's a supernatural element to it, but it very much is kind of it's shown in a way that it could be supernatural. There could be a supernatural element to it, but that there could also be it could be somewhat grounded in realism in that um, the mask just was ripping at her face as it was glued to her face, so to speak.
I definitely agree that it's you could lean either way with it. I personally kind of lean more into the this is supernatural part of it, where I guess as soon as the masked samurai like just showed up at their hut, I immediately thought, okay, this is all happening for a reason. Like there's some larger, force at play here. There's a reason why he's there with the mask. Maybe it's the mask itself is doing its own kind of, bidding with how things are playing out. But I definitely felt like there was something ominous going on with the way the mask worked. And
I completely
yeah,
agree with you.
the whole build up and slow burn to this film and then what eventually happens, I want to stress that for me it definitely felt like the whole thing was basically a story of this sort of divine retribution where two like young people wanted to go and sort of be in love and do have an innocent romance essentially, but the older woman wanted to use the threat of going to hell as sort of to steer her away from that. And essentially, because of that, and using, uh, religion and faith to try to dissuade a rather innocent romance, causes this divine retribution in a sense, is sort of what I was getting from it. And it's creepy how it all plays out.
And yeah, there was one thing I did want to mention, and that was some of the film's elements that are, especially with the mask, to me reminded me of Nogaku Theater and the whole and No Theater itself, given how the mask can emit, for having one facial expression, can emit multiple emotions. And definitely, like when we first meet the masked warrior, to the masked warrior's demise, to once it's on the older woman, to even near the end when she's screaming in pain because she can't get the mask off. All of those emotions change and they show through the mask. And I think that's such a really clever and brilliant piece.
Yeah, for sure.
And that ending, the ending, which is very open-ended, just kind of hits you out of nowhere.
Yeah, it ends kind of similarly to how I've seen a few other Japanese films, specifically samurai films, and where it leaves you kind of just in the middle of sort of a cliffhanger, almost kind of a weird suspenseful moment. It just kind of cuts and it's like, okay, so what's gonna happen here? The big thing you often see with this film before you watch it is obviously in the posters and the all the, I don't want to say art for it, but promotional material for it you see has to do with the mask, and the mask doesn't come in until like essentially the final act.
Yeah, the last hour of the film.
Yeah. So it's unique, but the way it comes in, obviously, it's used very well, and it's as soon as that comes in, the film becomes sort of this thriller, or it's hard to call it exactly horror. There's not necessarily, I mean, although it is considered a horror film, it's obviously for the time, there's no jump scares, there's no obviously gore or anything, but it's just spooky. It kind of has those spooky vibes.
One of the elements that add to the horror and spooky vibes regarding it is probably the just the atmosphere of the setting. The tall grass really has this almost sentient vibe to it, given that like there are like certain shots where as the camera moves, there you don't see any humans running around, but you
Yeah,
see the
no.
grass moving, and that's how you know where there's somebody. And when I was watching the film, that was the one of the things that really popped out for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's you really only see them and the few samurai who are making their way through the area. I don't remember if the film itself gives a exact location as to where they are, though. Do you remember if they do or not?
I don't think they did it. It just kind of
Okay.
exists.
I'm guessing the film maybe wants you to think it's taking place somewhere near Kyoto, at least somewhere in central Japan around there. And the reason I
Yeah, because
say
it's somewhere like south of Kyoto. That's they talk
yeah,
about that.
the 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 big takeaway, and here's I'm getting into history a little bit because it does connect to history and in a very interesting way, and in a way that I have not seen too many other films do. It sort of goes to an interesting period that isn't often talked about that much. This is essentially right at the point where the Ashikaga shogunate is coming into power. So you have the fall of the Kamakura shogunate happened in, I believe it is 1333, at the end of the Genko War, and for a little while there you had this thing called the Kinmu Restoration, where there was an emperor who was restored to power. He had triumphed over the shogunate, and now he wanted to essentially return power back over to the emperor, him, and essentially change, the entire shape of politics in Japan. However, by doing so, he would also alienate all the samurai who had just fought for him, because now he wanted the samurai to essentially have a diminished role. So there was another war to come, and this is where we have Ashikaga Takauji, who comes in as this leading figure for the samurai to essentially reestablish samurai control. And they talk about Ashikaga Takauji, and they talk about Kusunoki Masashige, who was the famous defender of the emperor. And they talk about I forget if they mention it, but they'll just allude to it. But there's the big battle at Minatogawa. Actually, yeah, they talk about it. The big battle at Minatogawa, where Masashige died. And Masashige is an extremely important figure because later, during the rise of Imperial Japan, he was sort of brought back as this big imperial martyr. And essentially, they have this big statue to him. I believe it's in Tokyo. Really awesome samurai statue, and he's sort of this just symbol of just resolute loyalty to the emperor, because he fought and died in the emperor's name at Minatogawa. So the fact that they're talking about this time period, these few years that aren't often talked about, is really interesting.
Another thing I wanted to talk about was about Kaneto Shindo, because despite his two best known films being Onibaba and Karenenko, a lot of people just don't realize that he directed 48 films, he wrote 238 scripts, and he was making movies right up until his dying day. He died at 100, 2012, and he had just finished a film that was made when he was 98.
Wow.
And that just, I'm not sure if that's like a world record for the oldest film made by a oldest director for a film, but it definitely feels like it should be. A lot of his films are not scary or horror films. He just has these two films in his filmography that pretty much partially influenced the rest of Japanese horror from the 70s onward.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like his other films that a lot of them deal with just Japan during World War II.
I was gonna say there's a couple things that he does in Kuroneko that I feel make it just a bit spookier than Onibaba.
Okay.
And it just has to do with there's a lot more kind of, I mean, there are ghosts in that film. It's very obvious they are ghosts, and the way that they kind of glide around in these kind of old architecture, and it's kind of like, at night, everything's kind of black, kind of hard to see, but then there's a very bright gown like figure in the distance kind of going across something, and it's very spooky, and I think he does a bit more in that one to kind of heighten the kind of horror vibe than necessarily Onibaba. Not saying it's better, but just in terms of kind of spookiness.
Even for a black and white film, this is one of those films where the black and white aspect is almost like it's darker than it should be. Like it's a lot more monochrome than normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has to be there for a reason, given that it's darker and it's a darker tale, and I think that adds to it immensely. So
Yeah, and I noticed a lot that they focused on, of course, just shots of the tall grass and
yes,
blowing in the wind and in the rain, and it kind of like it kind of, I think, lends to the vibe of isolation. And then I think the tall grass and sort of the where they live is sort of its own almost character that consumes the characters of the story.
yes, absolutely. And the other thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit is the film's sexuality. So there's a bit of nudity in this film that's can be a little surprising, given it came out in the 60s when that stuff wasn't really as well received. But then again, it's a different country. It's not like America. And when they tried to when the film was like released in the UK, it had to be heavily edited. So a lot of the scenes where the two women are topless, a lot of that was cut out.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that it was refused syndication until that was cut.
Yeah. And once the film got better recognition as time went on, then it got like proper releases and better home video releases. And for the longest time, the only way that you could see it in America was through the Criterion edition DVD from 2003.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the film's sexuality is very similar to other some Japanese films that added horror and sexuality kind of working together.
Yeah.
Also, I was going to go into the score a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about music too at some point. I think we probably have different opinions on the music in this film.
All right, so I think it's very interesting how for a score that takes place in feudal Japan, and it's almost a jazz score in that it's like you have the obvious taiko drumming that's present every time she puts on the mask and runs around scaring people with the mask, but also there's just like moments of like jazz score that's feels a little out of place, but I kind of if it's in this perspective where they are is this limbo area, I kind of appreciate it a little more. But if it's kind of grounded in reality, it's a little off, I think.
With in particular with the jazz, this is something you definitely see a lot. As soon as the 1960s rolled around, it seems like every Japanese film had to have some sort of jazz score. Not all of them, but almost every one of them. You saw it in Godzilla films. You see it in the samurai films, like films like Yojimbo.
Oh yeah, Yojimbo.
Yeah, Yojimbo is super jazzy. I kind of find it annoying, actually. It's just because although I like jazz, like sometimes it's like, oh, do I really need this? And it's more just kind of wild. I don't know if there's probably a specific name for what kind of jazz it is, but it doesn't, I don't know, it kind of takes it away from me and takes me out of like the mood. Where then you have films like, for example, Harakiri, which although it came out in the '60s, uses more traditional instruments and traditional kind of scoring to kind of set the tone, and I think really does a really good job. And then you go back to samurai films in the '50s, and you have I'm gonna Seven Samurai, an amazing score. That's obviously more orchestral. Same thing with the Samurai trilogy, the three films with Toshiro Mifune, where he played Mimoto Musashi.
Yes,
These
yes.
very kind of dramatic, sweeping orchestral stuff, and then even going all the way back to Rashomon, that has really a really nice kind of typical orchestral score, but really good music nonetheless. So it's almost kind of night and day when all of a sudden you get to the '60s and you have these much more jazzy scores that are kind of jarring at first, especially when you're going to this kind of you know you're gonna be watching a sort of samurai horror film, and all of a sudden you get this jazz music playing, and it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, it is jarring. I know the more I think about it, the more I kind of liked it. But I could definitely see how it can it can make or break like the tone if
Yeah.
that's your style. So
I definitely believe it is a personal preference thing, and I know just
I mean, this is going
for
to
me
be kind of
personally.
yeah, this is going to be kind of weird, but like it, the only thing it can remind me of is like when you watch something like more modern, like you watch like A Knight's Tale, and
Yeah,
it's this pretty damn great medieval film, and then out of nowhere, here's Queen, here's uh
right.
Lowrider,
Yeah,
here's AC/DC.
you're totally right, and I would put it in that category with it if it wasn't what almost all other Japanese films at the time were doing, because
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
definitely like it seemed like it was just the common trend at the time. It wasn't like it was necessarily this big artistic choice, but it was kind of just what most of the other films seemed like they were doing. I could be totally wrong, but that's what it seems like
yeah.
from my perspective at least.
Yeah, I get that. I get that completely.
Um, but I'm gonna throw a different question at you now. Um,
Sure.
So last year we of course reviewed we both watched Kwaidan and talked about that, and of course in Kwaidan there are four different stories, kind of suspenseful, somewhat horror stories. Um, in your opinion, I know Kwaidan is of course from a different director and is very differently styled, but what film did you do you enjoy more?
Almost immediately, I'm gonna have to say Kwaidan because I'm more familiar with it. I've watched it more.
Mm,
However, I definitely call Onibaba up there. It's definitely like almost at a point when the scales are balanced with them. Um, I think obviously I think Kwaidan has a little more to say, given that it's in color and it has the music is radically different.
mm.
Um, but I definitely
Doesn't have that jazz.
doesn't have that jazz. I'm all about that jazz. But I do think that Onibaba is one of the one of the best Japanese films I've ever seen. And it definitely there's praise. The praise is there for a reason,
Hmm.
and um, I'm becoming a bigger fan of slower moving cinema as I get older, and I
Yeah.
think that this one has well, definitely like the first 45 minutes are a lot are very slow and kind of in building up the characters and building up the world that they've built. Um, but in a similar on a similar note, like one of the criticisms I had for Kwaidan was just how um the first those three stories are between 15 to 30 minutes each, and then that middle story is like an hour and 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's a little that's the only jarring thing I could call to it. I can think of them off the top of my head, but I still I would have to say Kwaidan is, I think, a little more superior, but only by a small margin. Because I don't know, the more I think about Onibaba, the more I really like it.
Yeah, I have to agree with that for the most part. For me it's hard because although I enjoyed Kwaidan, there was definitely one story in particular that stood out to me, and that was of course Hoichi the earless.
Yes.
And I think if I were to put just Hoichi the earless up next to Onibaba, I would prefer Hoichi. But the fact is that it's a whole movie with four different stories in it for in terms of Kwaidan, uh, and I didn't necessarily, although each of them were interesting, some of them I enjoyed less than others, and
Yeah.
that's why I think I would rather sit through Onibaba again entirely than sit through Kwaidan necessarily right away again, because Kwaidan, of course, has those ones that I kind of would sort of fast forward through to get to the other ones that I do want to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that completely.
If you were to rate this out of 4 stars, what would you rate Onibaba?
3.5 stars.
3.5.
3.5. Probably if I think about it more and um I revisited it, I might give it 4 stars. Um, it all depends really, but for my initial first viewing, 3.5 stars. I think it's a great movie.
I think I would actually agree with you. 3.5 stars. I would give it a full star for the plot, a full star for the characters, because I do feel the characters. I know we didn't talk about them as much as I wanted to here because I mean there's not a lot to say.
No, really.
They're I wouldn't say they're one dimensional, but it's they obviously have depth, but it's just they each do good for what they are and what they portray, and there's more beneath the surface, but it doesn't necessarily give you all that much, but you don't necessarily need that much. So I would give it a full star for characters. I would give it a full star for historical accuracy simply because they do reference a point in history that it's accurate to talk about that. I wasn't looking too closely at the armor and weapons. I don't know if I imagine if someone were to pause it and look at it and be like, oh, that's not the right type of shoulder plate they should have. I wasn't looking at for that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
historical accuracy obviously was great for what it was, full star. I would give it a half star for the composition, though, for the cinematography, music, and editing. I think the editing and the music, of course, editing and cinematography were fantastic. It's just that music that does get to me. I think that's where I'd give it a half star for that. But
I
three and
get
a half
that.
stars for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my only the half a star I'd give it was um I guess with the plot, because I just think that the first then nothing really happens for the first 45 minutes, and that uh kind of irked me a little bit. But that being said, the last hour of the film kind of
You see,
stopped all that.
I
Made that.
I agree that obviously it was a very slow burn. And I feel like though that early stuff, of course, was setting up for the stuff that was to come, and I think it did a very good job of world building that
Yes.
first act in kind of setting you, okay, this is what's going on with not only what's going on in the swamp or where they are, but also in across Japan too. It establishes what time period it is and everything by just talking about the wars going on.
Yeah. 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 I agree with you there. Definitely.
All right, so yeah, that was our sort of review discussion of Onibaba. I definitely really had a good time with this one. Is there anything in closing you wanna say, Mac, about any about your upcoming projects again, or anything, or anything you want to add?
Well, nothing really too much. I mean, I'm working on on a script right now. It's probably won't see the light of day for a while. But I enjoy doing this. It's always a pleasure, my man. It's always great to talk about stuff with you. And hopefully sooner rather than later, we can get to do this again with another one. You can find me at MackZGreat, MackZegreat, on Twitter, on Instagram, and yeah, those are my two best ways to handle me, to get to me. I'm doing all through October, I am doing little things here and there for um like new movies and movies I haven't seen in a while for October. And on Friday nights, I do live streams where I read ghost stories. So if you have some ghost stories you'd like to send my way, please do. I would love to uh, sit down by some candlelight and read them out to whoever's out there to listen.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most entertaining, interesting, and enjoyable.